Good evening and welcome to Zion's Banner. The desk you see behind me is we're rearranging the office, and that desk will give me a little bit more facility and allow for a different camera angle and just kind of stretch my equipment out, which I'm really kind of grateful for. So that will be the way I will be in just a short while from now. By way of tomorrow, we have had the triumphal entry, or what is known as Good Friday. And so Thursday's broadcast, which occurs during the Passover week and directly between, shouldn't say Good Friday, Palm Sunday and Good Friday and Easter, will be about the triumphal entry. So tomorrow we'll look at what we can learn from the triumphal entry and kind of jump ahead in Matthew a little bit because we're in a very special season where a lot of things are spiritually highlighted. And so that's what we're going to end up doing. So that'll be tomorrow's broadcast, kind of a special little treat. Tonight, we're going to kind of conclude our discussion of the doctrine of mediation, that there needs to be a mediator between God and man, kind of finish up with Rabbi Singer's objections. And look at some really neat scripture in the process. So I'm going to get us to the PowerPoint, and a shout out to Chris, who's here, and Brother Steve. So let me get that share up. That's a screen share. And now I have a few surprises for you in this particular presentation. Because I've been doing a little work with something that I think will add something to the broadcast. Let me make sure that we're there. We are there now. Tonight we have Leah joining us, but we really have two people joining us as far as my virtual assistants. And so we'll just introduce one. Again, you know, the whole coffee story, but I don't know. We're creating our own inside jokes, so to speak, which is really neat. If you haven't been here before, that's okay. You'll get in the swing of things. And if you're watching and you don't really care to get on the inside jokes, then just kind of enjoy them. Now I'm going to bring up our detractors corner.
Rather creates a intermediary between God and man. It openly says this in the Christian Bible in 1 Timothy 2, verse 5. There's one God and one mediator between God and man, and that's the man Jesus Christ. So there you are. That's what all Christians...
Okay, I didn't really want you to have to hear him very long tonight. That's our favorite sort of detractor, right? We're familiar with him, but he's representative of detractors. And so it is good to deal with his objections because really the objections take new forms, but there are some key features of our faith that are going to be slapped at. And it always revolves around who Jesus is. Okay, because that really is the bottom line. You will notice the picture of the Pope there again. That's really a red herring, and that's not an honest appraisal of Christianity at all. But I want you to notice the verse that he really takes issue, and that's 1 Timothy 2. The verse was actually put up there. He actually put New Testament up there. And so we're going to take a look at this final thing. Now we need to remember the real issue. And I've already introduced our virtual partner, Leah, but again, we'll be joined. We have to remember the real issue. The issue is not whether people can pray to God. I'm not going to walk up to somebody who's praying to God and get all angry at them for praying to God. And, you know, we have people open sporting events with prayer that I'm not sure are believers at all. But there's a bigger issue here, whether people can be in the presence of God without a mediator of some sort being necessary. Now, Judaism is not simply about being able to address the deity. If that's all there was to Judaism and that's all there was to spirituality, Singer would have maybe more of a footing, and other Jewish polemicists would also. But Judaism is very much about the presence of God. And so really making the issue about just praying to God is not the whole story here. Okay, now I'm going to go back here and go ahead and keep our slides moving. Something got stuck. Now, this gives me a chance to introduce a Hebrew word. So I'm really glad Brother Steve's here. He used to like when I did this, and not always does a lesson lend itself to an easy Hebrew word, but this is the word that really has the idea of to approach. In fact, korban, which is used in the Gospels, is taken from this word. It has the idea of to draw near, karav. And so there's your kind of Hebrew word for today. And see, that's what the real issue is under what conditions can I draw near to God? Can I be in his presence? And so you have the list of meanings there. Now, remember, there's a range of meanings, okay? But they all center around approaching or being in the presence of or drawing near to. And so that's our Hebrew word, and it really fits in with this because the real issue isn't about being able to address deity. The real issue is about karav, being able to draw near. Now let's understand the very Jewish claim of 1 Timothy 2, the very Jewishness of 1 Timothy 2, and the false claim by polemicists. And so we're going to get to listen, and this has been fun to work with, on a conversation between Leah, who I already introduced, and Bridget, one of the other virtual helpers that you've seen on these posts. And so I'm going to go ahead and get this started. All right. So the question was, are there indications or are there situations or are there places outside of the Levitical priesthood in which there's a mediator between God and man? And then, of course, the question is, why is this important? So you have two questions here. And they really introduce what we're going to talk about tonight. And then we're going to bring it around to 1 Timothy. Okay. Now, if there are mediators between God and man outside of the Levitical system, it's an indication that this is a basic feature between man and God after the fall. See, if it was just the Levitical system, you could kind of say that the Levitical system in the 5 books of Moses and in the Bible represents kind of a fluke, a unique feature that is not true as a principle throughout the Old Testament. And that type of claim could be made. Now, if God requires a mediator between himself and humankind after the fall, then we know, if it's a basic feature, that it's not a fluke, and the basis in the Jewish scriptures for Paul's statement in 1 Timothy 2. So what I'm saying is, Paul had a basis if this is a basic feature of the Old Testament record, as opposed to being a unique feature of the Levitical priesthood. And we've talked about the Levitical priesthood and this being a basic feature. So I thought I'd go back before the Levitical priesthood. I mean, does this sort of thing occur at all in general? And I thought I'd even go beyond the Jewish people and say, is this a thing that occurs between humankind and God outside of the Jewish people? I mean, is this just a peculiarity of God's relationship with the Jewish people, or is it something that is a basic feature? And so I could have gone to a lot of places and probably a lot more places, but I thought Abimelech is kind of an interesting character to look at. And so Abimelech and the situation between him and Abraham appears in Genesis 20. Now, if I were to break this down according to some sort of outline, I would say that verses 1 and 2 is where Abraham deceives Abimelech by presenting Sarah as his sister. He should have presented Sarah as his wife, or not presenting Sarah as his wife. That's the way he should have presented. Now, there's an element of truth in his statements, but, a half-truth is a whole lie. And so he is not being honest with Abimelech. In 3-7, God's going to protect Abimelech from sinning in ignorance. I want you to notice that. Can God prevent people from sinning? Well, God can prevent people from sinning. He doesn't always do it, but this was a sin in ignorance. And so God protects Abimelech. In fact, Abimelech goes to God and says, I didn't want to sin. And God says, I know the integrity of your heart. And by the way, Abraham's charge in terms of Abimelech was, say you are my sister, because there is no fear of God here. And yet Abimelech did have a moral sense and some sort of fear there, and would not have done so had he known that this was Abraham's wife. And so Abraham has mistaken where Abimelech was at morally, and God protected Abimelech from this sin because Abimelech would have been sinning in ignorance, not in the intent to go ahead and actually take Abraham's wife. And he also gives him the procedure for straightening things out. Now, why does Abimelech need this procedure? Because when he took Abraham's wife, he brought down the curse of the Abrahamic covenant upon him. Now, the interesting thing about that is the curse of the Abrahamic covenant works in kind. All right. So what you do comes back to bite you in much the same way as you did it. By depriving Abraham of Sarah, he deprived Abraham of progeny. God's move is to deprive Abimelech of progeny. So all of his wives become barren. Now, let's get to where there is actually a mediator. Sarah is restored to Abraham. Abraham explains his conduct. Abraham intercedes for Abimelech, acting as a mediator in Abimelech's house, for Abimelech and his house, and his wives are restored. So where do I get the mediator from this whole thing? God required Abraham to act as a mediator between him and Abimelech. God required Abimelech to use Abraham as a mediator between him and God. Why didn't Abimelech just get the procedure of praying to God, restoring Sarah, praying to God himself, and his wives would have been non-barren? Because God was not going to let Abimelech just walk into his presence. And so he actually requires Abraham to mediate between the two of them, to act in a priestly role between Abimelech and himself. Now, if anybody can just walk into God's presence the way Jewish polemicists would like to play this, then God would have said to Abimelech, return Sarah, give a little bit of some sort of stipend here, I don't know how to put this, a gift, to make things right between you and Abraham, and you just pray to me, and I'll go ahead and I'll take care of this whole thing. But God doesn't say that. God doesn't say, Abimelech, you can pray to me anytime you want, enter my presence willy-nilly. No, you have to go through Abraham to enter my presence. Now, one might say, but wait a minute, Abraham isn't God. Why is this going on here? Remember the Abrahamic covenant and what's going on in the big story. Israel becomes a beachhead, and Abraham becomes the father of the people beachhead that God's going to set up in a fallen world. And so Abraham has a unique priestly role here, given the role that God is going to give him and his ancestors. Shout out to Elizabeth. She's got her own station going, a little more on that. And Air Church, it's really good to have you here. And so what I'm saying is that Abraham's role and the fact that God does require a mediator combined here, so that Abraham acted as the mediator or priest figure between Abimelech and God. Contrary to God just wanting everybody, regardless of a mediator, to just waltz into his presence, the way this looks. Now we're going to talk a little bit about Melchizedek. Now, the reason I picked Melchizedek is he's not a Jew. Let's get that out in the open right now. Melchizedek is not a Jew. He is not Abraham's offspring. And let me explain this just so you have a little help here. If you've never heard this before, one is not even a Jew if they're descended just from Abraham. Because remember, Ishmael was also physically Abraham's son, although Sarah was not his mother. And thanks for the shout out, Air Church, to like and share. And so what you need to understand here is, well, okay, so you have to be a son of Abraham and Isaac. Well, now, wait a minute now. Isaac had two sons. And who were those sons? Well, Esau and Jacob. Jacob's the line, so being of Abraham and Isaac wouldn't be enough. You have to be really descended from all three. Now, Slam put a comment up here, and I guess in the flow of the teaching here, I'm going to stick that up. I hope you didn't mean not to write that. Maybe that's like a typo or something. Let me clarify something. The New Testament never teaches there are no Jews. It teaches being ethnically Jewish doesn't get you one iota as far as the presence and relationship with God. Because Israel failed. And when we talk about the triumphal end, we will talk about why Jesus goes and presents himself to Israel first. But that's for tomorrow night. So that gives you a taste of some neat stuff as we look over that thing. But that could be a mistype. But what you do need to understand is there are Jews. There are Israelites. The Israelites are the Jews, and the Jews are the Israelites dispersed. So add a couple thousand years of some different food, different climates, and maybe a little mixing in here, and you've got where the Jews are today. Because the punishment, the divine judgment, is exile. And so that's why you have that. Melchizedek is by no means a Jew. He is not descended from the patriarchs. He's a contemporary of Abraham. Now, I believe firmly that he was a human being because he was king over a human territory. Okay, Air Church clarified that. Thank you. Okay, right. And Slam is right. There were no Jews at the time of Melchizedek. Thank you for clarifying that. I didn't see the at the time of Melchizedek there. So it could just, things like that happen. But thanks for chiming in there. Very glad to understand it the way it was meant. Melchizedek was the king of Salem. Salem was an actual place. Okay, and he was the physical king of Salem. In other words, he physically ruled over this area. And he brought out bread and wine to Abraham. He being a priest of the Most High God, he blessed him, that would be Abraham, and said, "Blessed be Abram," Abram, but actually in Hebrew it's Avram, of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. By the way, the possessor of heaven and earth goes back to God Most High. It's parallel. He's not calling Abraham the possessor of heaven and earth, because we don't want that impression at all. So Melchizedek, the priest, who's not at all a Jew. So he doesn't fall under the Levitical priesthood. That's my point. Okay, here's an example of mediation. Okay, someone between God and man, because he's blessing Abraham. That doesn't mean he's giving Abraham a candy. It's not like I'm blessing Abraham, I'm giving him a candy bar. He is officially blessing Abraham, standing in as a representative of God. So God is mediating his blessing through Melchizedek. All right. Now, he's not a Levitical priest. This is not at the time of Sinai. This is way prior to Sinai. So this is outside of the law code, but still within the Torah. Because remember, the Torah is not really just the law code. You got 5 whole books here. And you got to kind of deal with that. Okay? Now, this would belittle the need for the epistle to Hebrews, Jewish followers of Jesus, to return to reliance on the temple system if no mediator was needed. The only hope this claim can be made now is because the temple is destroyed. Now, understand this. During the time when the temple stood, Judaism could never be said to believe this. I mean, could you imagine during the time of the Second Temple period, a video by a Jewish polemicist saying there's no need for a mediator between man and God? And this is what's so interesting. The writer of Hebrews is concerned that Jewish believers will return to a reliance upon the cultic temple system. In other words, the sacrificial system. Now, if you go back to that time period, pre-70 AD, okay, Hebrews would not need to be written. In other words, they could have just had a polemicist like the one we heard stand up and say, oh, you Hebrews who follow Jesus and all the rest of you Jews stand in the temple court, you have no real need for a mediator. And so the very point of Hebrews is not that a mediator isn't needed. It's who the mediator is, but you don't need to return to the temple system. And if we remove that issue, we also remove the need for the book in our New Testament. No one would have had to write it. There would have been no issue. So now we end up having Sarah back with her cup of coffee. What does this tell us? This tells us there's an extreme irony here. Jewish polemicists claim there's no need for a mediator between God and man, but they can only do so because Judaism is no longer the Judaism of the Bible. Therefore, based on an altered Judaism, which the rabbis had no right to create, the argument is being put forth that Judaism says there's no need for a mediator. In other words, true Judaism that existed prior to the rabbis altering it would never have said this, and the only reason they could say it is because they've already altered Judaism and are not practicing Torah Judaism to begin with. So they're making a claim on the fact that they changed something that was clearly true in Judaism to say it wasn't very Jewish, which is an extremely sort of ridiculous argument. I mean, look at what's being said here. And so when you're talking to your Jewish friend, you only have to go back to the Torah and to the entire temple system and the material there. But the irony is that the claim they're making doesn't really make any sense. And the New Testament they're complaining about is addressing an issue they say shouldn't even exist. Now, what really fascinates me is God's acting as his own mediator between himself and man. You know, this is really strange to me. Not only are there men appointed as mediators, but God actually acts as his own mediator because he's that concerned about having a mediator that is the right mediator between God and man. And ultimately, a perfect mediator was needed. That's what Hebrews is about too. The superiority of Jesus as a mediator because the Levitical mediators were far from perfect. But there are even places where God sets himself up to be the mediator between himself as God and man, because mediation is needed. In other words, man can not come into presence, God's presence himself after the fall to such an extent that God himself occasionally steps in and acts as a mediator in order to make it very clear that a mediator is necessary and that all of his blessings and presence are mediated. In fact, what we see in the Old Testament is that God's presence is always mediated after the fall. So, now, Sarah can even spend some time in some background. Doesn't that look like a pretty scene? I kind of like it. It just kind of goes off into the sunset. And she's managed to bring her coffee along. And so, she's got a question to ask, or a statement. So she's basically reiterating what was said here, and she's kind of summarizing and saying, so God was so concerned about mediation that he actually did it himself. So let's look at mediation between man and God after the fall in the Old Testament. The angel of the Lord. Now, what's interesting here is this is an incident with Hagar, who is also not Jewish. In fact, if you want to know where the people that claim to come from Ishmael come from, they are actually the result of Hagar, who is an Egyptian, most likely, because she's called the Egyptian maidservant of Sarah. That's where I kind of get that idea. And whoever she had children with. And, after Ishmael, I don't know what ended up happening. We kind of lose track of her. We get to see Ishmael's progeny. The angel of the Lord found her. Now, Hagar's run away from Sarah because Sarah is not being very nice about things. But in all fairness, she was a little bit flaunting the fact that she could give Abraham a child and Sarah couldn't, which, really kind of irritated Sarah. And so Sarah kind of responds negatively to this whole thing. And the angel of the Lord asks her, found her by the well, by the spring, in the desert on the way to shore. And he said, Hagar, Sarah's servant, notice the way it's called, where have you come from and where are you going? Now, just to take a split second, give you a little bit of extra value, look at the question Hagar's asked. It's very much like the question Cain is asked, where is your brother Abel? God is constantly doing that because he wants people to fess up and to be straight and to be honest. If you can't be perfect, you can at least be honest, right? And she said, I'm fleeing the presence of my mistress, Sarah. Notice the language there. She's fleeing the presence of Sarah. And the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress. Wow, that's got to be a real fun thing. And submit yourself under her hand. Oh, yay. The angel of the Lord said, I will multiply your descendants exceedingly. Now, notice how similar this is to the Abrahamic covenant. The promise of a seed or a progeny. And they shall not be counted. And, that's given. The angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are with child, and you will have a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael. So that's where Ishmael gets his name, because God has heard your affliction. He will be a wild man, and his hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. Wow. You can answer for yourself whether you think this is prophetically working out if you consider Islam the religion of Ishmael. And you can put that together. I'm not going to give you answers to that, but I'm going to say that that's incredibly interesting. He will dwell in the presence of his brethren. And then she called on the name of the Lord who spoke to her. I'm sorry, who did she call on? The name of the Lord who spoke to her. Now, God has mediated between Hagar and himself, hearing her prayers and then responding to her prayers. So how does God relate to Hagar? He does so in a mediatorial way. He sends himself in a unique form to act as a personal mediator between Hagar and himself. It's one thing for God to end up overhearing your prayers. It's another for God to hear your prayers with the intent of responding to them. So that's kind of an interesting scene. And Lindsay put a great comment up there. God always seems to give us the opportunity to fess up. Yes, because I believe he longs to be merciful. And he is a God of truth. So that is important stuff. You can't end up being forgiven of something you didn't know, that you're not willing to think was wrong. I forgive you for getting me roses. Your wife saying that just doesn't make a lot of sense. And so there you go. God even uses a mediator with Abraham. Why not just have Abraham in the Father's presence? I mean, it doesn't seem to work that way. The angel of the Lord's the one that calls to him from heaven. The angel of the Lord is God, but God doesn't make a personal appearance here. God relates to Abraham through an intermediary, but the intermediary happens to be him. So shout out to Raymond the Large. And so what I'm saying is there's this really unique sort of feature here where God not only has mediators prior to the Levitical priesthood, he not only has a mediator outside the Levitical priesthood, that would be Melchizedek, but he actually goes to the trouble to interpose a mediator between himself and man, taking on the job himself. Now, if Hagar could just go to God and run into God's presence willy-nilly, and Abraham could too, then there would be no need for all this pomp and circumstances here. Now, remember, we've distinguished. The polemicist wants to make it about whether people can pray to God. Anyone can pray to God. It's about being in God's presence and whether God has a self-imposed obligation to hear your prayers with the intent to act on them in some manner, even if it means no. And so the polemicist is missing the point to a large extent, and he's missing the flow of Scripture. Now, if I understand Jesus as the ultimate incarnation of the angel of the Lord, then what we're saying in Timothy is going to make perfect sense when we expand it out. You see, Jewish polemicists, if the angel of the Lord is God, and he is the mediator or a mediator between man and God, and Jesus is the incarnated angel of the Lord, then it makes perfect sense to plug that into the understanding of Paul and Timothy. And we're going to see why. And it will affect how we understand Timothy. So, I have Malachi 1 and 2. Now, this should do it. I'll bring it up if it doesn't read quite the way I planned. O you priests, this commandment is for you if you will not hear, and if you will not take it to heart, to give glory to my name, says the Lord, I will send. This is like a verse too early, folks. So let me stop the screen share and just take you there because the numbering's off a little bit here from what I would prefer. And I want to get this up here and get Malachi up here for you. And I'll just pull that right up. And let's just go and look at it right from the scriptures. And I'll bring the magnification up for you. Because this is not where I want to be. And I think I'm a verse off or two. There we go. I'm going to do a screen share, and I'm going to increase the size here. Okay, there we go. And let me do the share. Okay, screen 2. And let's put that up full. That'll increase it, okay? Behold, I send my messenger. By the way, that's the same word for angel in Hebrew. Just to let you know. So when you see the word angel and you see the word messenger, it could be a human messenger or a celestial messenger, part of God's celestial family, as it were. And the difference in the Hebrew is the context. That's what determines that. And you can see the Hebrew there. I can even go to where it is. There's the word messenger right there. Okay. Malachi, which is, by the way, Malachi. It's actually the name of the book. There's the irony. Behold, I send my messenger to prepare the way, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple, even the messenger, Malachi, Well, actually, not Melechi, because it's not in the plural. Okay, so when I get there, it's just malach habrit, the messenger of the covenant. And so what does this have to do with Jesus being the angel of the Lord? I mean, am I going crazy here as too much learning, like, they accuse Paul of here? Let's look at this and let's talk about Hebrew parallelism. This is a feature that's going to help you a lot. See, if nothing else, I'm giving you tools to look at your Hebrew text. It's a rhetorical device. It's interesting that Mark Allen Powell is the author of this particular Bible dictionary article. He does a lot of work for Logos Bible Software. It's a rhetorical device involving one or more linguistic repetitions or correspondences, a grammatical, lexical, semantic, or phonetic in adjacent lines or phrases. Although it's present in prose, it's more prominent in poetry, which means it can occur in prose, but it is more common. And I don't, if you have any questions, just put them right up there. Now, why did I do this? Okay. Because there's a parallelism in the Hebrew here. Okay. The Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. Who's the Lord whom you seek? Notice it's all in caps. The messenger or angel of the covenant. I think it's a clear reference to the angel of the Lord, especially when we look at the angel of the Lord's role in the Exodus. Okay. Now, what is being said there is the Lord whom you seek will come to his temple. Now, this is during the rebuilding of the temple, and the temple in mind here is what becomes Herod's temple with some additions to it, repairs to it, and improvements. Because between that second temple being rebuilt and Herod's temple, there's not a destruction there. Okay. And so what we see here is who appeared at the temple in terms of the events around Palm Sunday. Well, Jesus did. Well, then he must be the Lord whom you seek. And if the Lord whom you seek and the messenger of the covenant is the same, then he's the messenger of the covenant. And since I think that's a clear reference back to the angel of the Lord, then we could say that Jesus is indeed the same personage as the angel of the Lord when it's used of God. Are you following me? Now, let's put this into context with Timothy, and we're going to get close to kind of wrapping it, but let me show you what's going on here, okay? First of all, Timothy is a young man with extreme Jewish background who's been very well trained. Okay, he's the son of a Jewish mother. Now, he did have a Greek father that produces some issues, but his training from his mother and grandmother gave him instruction, and he was very devout. So he has a Jewish background. The Torah is not something he's unfamiliar with. Origen thinks he's a relative of Paul, the apostle, but that's unproven. And there's some questions with that. It is indicated that his father was probably what's called a proselyte at the gate. Now, that's not a full convert to Judaism. That's someone who accepts. We've talked about the different levels of proselyte. He's somebody who accepts the morality, shall we call it Judaic morality, and worships God generally as the one true God, but does not come into a full practice or even a more devout practice. In other words, there's acknowledgement of the one true God. He's a God-fearer, but he's not necessarily a full convert. Now, remember that in those days, to be a full convert meant that a male had to undergo surgery. And so that surgery without anesthesia produces problems. And so that was a little bit of a dissuader. The word of God was truth. Now it says the father remained an unbeliever. That's in terms of being a Christian unbeliever, most likely. The mother was already converts to Christ before Paul's journey. That means that Timothy had already heard of Jesus when Paul comes, and the apostle finds him. Now, why did I do all this? Because the letter to Timothy, 1st and 2nd, are personal letters. This 1st Timothy letter is a personal letter from a Jewish man trained as a rabbi under one of the greatest rabbis of the day, devout in his loyalty to the faith of his fathers. Paul says as much as in Acts, to a young man who identified with the Jewish people and was trained in the Hebrew scriptures. So I'm giving you Timothy's background and what Timothy would have been familiar with. And Paul knows Timothy's upbringing. He mentions the training that Timothy received since he was a child from his mother and grandmother. So Paul is aware of what Timothy had received. And so the background of 1st and 2nd Timothy is still very much a Jewish background with additional pastoral instruction, because Timothy is left to be an elder at one of the churches that Paul plants. It's believed that Timothy did some time being an elder and pastoring the church at Ephesus, but again, we're getting into the realms of church tradition. So let's start putting it all together, okay? Now, the complaint is about 1 Timothy 2:5. There is one God and one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus. Now, I'm going to paraphrase that with our insights in just a second, but I want you to notice that this verse even starts out with a clear statement of monotheism that is reminiscent of the Shema. There is one God, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Paul is literally writing a condensed version of the Shema at the beginning of the verse. Don't miss this. Any sort of comments about Paul being a hack and a pagan and somebody who didn't know anything are ridiculous in light of his references to the Hebrew scriptures and the way he uses them. And there's one mediator, focus on the one between God and man. So we have God and then a mediator between God and man. Now, who is the mediator between God and man? Christ Jesus. So Messiah is then the mediator. Now, if we put this all together, watch how this ends up working. In other words, with this understanding, there's one God and one mediator who is the final and ultimate mediator pictured by all the previous mediators in the Tanakh or Hebrew scriptures. Okay? Between God and human beings, the person, Messiah, Jesus. Now, I did person because man there is indeed referring to a male, but his humanity is what's being emphasized here. The man, Christ Jesus, is Paul's way of saying Jesus, the human being, Jesus. So Paul is literally saying that Jesus is the ultimate pinnacle of a long line of mediators, which can clearly be found in the Tanakh or Hebrew scriptures. A long line of mediators that, by the way, we've seen in the Levitical priesthood, which continued from Sinai all the way until 70 AD, and included people outside of the Levitical line, such as Abraham himself acting in a priestly role, as well as Melchizedek. And so what we see here is that the statement that Paul makes in 1 Timothy 2:5 is not some sort of pagan addition that leads to idolatry. The placing of a mediator there does not lead to idolatry because it is a consistent feature throughout the Tanakh. And we looked at last week, we looked at modern Jewish thought. Now we've looked at the general flow of the text in the Tanakh, and we find that the same basic feature is there. So to argue that no mediator is needed at all, not only guts the Levitical system, which, by the way, guts an entire book of the Torah, because the book of Leviticus is just a manual for the priesthood and information for the people as how to operate under the theocracy and with a priesthood. But it goes further than that and does not take into account cases like Melchizedek and other cases like that. And also, in light of the fact that Jesus is probably the angel of the covenant, that angel of the Lord, which is God, by the way, interposing himself as a separate person, because the Son is not the Father, then incarnated as the ultimate mediator. So Paul's statements are not at all lead anyone to paganism. In fact, there is one God and one mediator between God and man, certainly would not lead anyone to paganism, because there's only allowed one mediator, not a bunch of saints, not Mary. And there's only one God, so we're talking about a strict monotheism here. In fact, my biggest questions for Catholics, my biggest question for Catholics is, where do you get Mary worship? Paul is very clear that there's one mediator between God and man, and there are no mediators between him and man. So from that standpoint, Catholicism has already violated 2 Timothy 2:5. 1 Timothy 2:5, and it's out of keeping with that very verse. Well, we went a little longer with the Passover. We'll be a little longer tonight, but I do want to kind of back up. It's good to see some people I haven't seen for a while. And we need to keep our sister Elizabeth in prayer. If you're following her on Facebook, I believe she had a station before, but she's mentioned that station. And I guess we just kind of need to keep things in mind. I will be in Yuma this weekend. I'm starting to have some dental problems, and I will be actually going to Biola to walk. They allowed us who didn't get to walk in December to actually walk. I hope to get some pictures that I can show folks or post on Patreon or do something with. But there's a little bit of a dental problem kind of starting to form. And so I really need that not to interfere with trips coming up. So I could use your prayers there. And so following the conversation here, but there's a lot of medical information here. And I don't see any questions or anything else coming up. We did clarify there were no Jews in Melchizedek's day, so that's good. All right, some special thanks. Oh, there we go. Let me put that up there. There we go. So, I don't know where Elizabeth was posting things prior. Thank you, Brother Steve. I really appreciate it. I do want to do one important thing here. I do want to play something else before we end tonight. For those who are on Patreon, you should be getting my Apolobites on the 2nd and my devotional on Passover on April 3rd. It will be posted, so you can check that out. I want to share a video file because I need to do that. So here we go. Thank you to everyone who supports us through Chosen People. I will show that up there. That is perfectly acceptable too. And we are doing new changes on the website, so feel free to check that out. Well, I'm going to remove that. There's additional comments there. All right. Thank you for the thank you. That was Slam. I'm going to probably close in prayer. I don't know if that helps or hurts on YouTube, but I just feel that we can go ahead and do that. If people are watching later and they're just coming and joining us and they're offended, enjoy the video. Try not to be offended and subscribe anyway. Better yet, come on, join us for a broadcast, and I will pray for you too. Lord, thank you so much for this evening, and I look forward to discussing the triumphal entry tomorrow. This is a special week. This is Holy Week, but Holy Week this year literally works out the way it did back then, with the Passover falling at the beginning in relation to almost exactly on the time that it did, and then Passover ends literally on Easter Sunday. And so this is a unique sort of week. I think about Elizabeth, who's having some health issues. There may be others out there. Lord, I pray that you keep people safe, that you'd allow them to worship, and that you'd allow them to spread the good news of the ultimate mediator between God and man, who is our risen Messiah. May we take advantage of this time of year. And I ask these things in the name of our Messiah, knowing that in him we are positioned so that we are literally, through him as the head of the councils in heaven, literally seated with him positionally, because we are united with him. And I know that you can enter into this sphere and do this work, and we are asking you as the Lord and Father of our Messiah Jesus, who has placed him above every other name, to enter in and to do things and to make yourself known in these situations. And it's in his precious name that we come to you. Amen. Let me take care of that. Yes. I've just received word through Chosen People about that. Slam says, why doesn't the name come up as a supporter? Because that was new. And so that has just become, I would say it hasn't just, but it's come onto the data I've received regularly. So when I received the first things, that sort of, I'm behind the times. Let me just apologize right now. I'm behind the times. I'm behind a month worth of information online. So I'm not sure I understand the question there, but I will go ahead and take care of those things. I'm a little bit behind. But yes, I did see the sheet that actually told me that has happened. So I really appreciate you, Slam. You know, I just see your moniker there, so I'm so used to that. But I really appreciate you, and I really appreciate your support. So I will take care of that, and I will put it on the right place, on the right thing. I have a question for Elizabeth. Are you still going to put your stuff on Facebook, or are you just switching to YouTube and you're going to ditch Facebook? Because before, Elizabeth was actually findable on Facebook. So if you want to shout out an answer or put that in the feed, that's perfectly fine. But Elizabeth did have her stuff up by YouTube, and she now seems to be moving it over to Facebook, if I get it correctly. Thank you, Elizabeth, for being a great mod. She stuck that up there. I appreciate it. And that is about it for tonight. So I will see folks hopefully tomorrow. And keep encouraging other folks to join us, grow the community. I was also thinking you could let me know what you think of the dialogues. They're actual animations. So I'm now able to do little animations with my virtual helpers, which is kind of fun. Elizabeth says, yes, her stuff will be on Facebook also. So you can find her in either location. There you go. You heard it here. And thank you, Air Church. So Erev Tov. And remember your Hebrew word, karav. That's your Hebrew word for tonight.